a lesson. You may have heard these words before, but I'll teach you what they really mean. Go beyond! Plus!
What is up, you guys? Plus hoster James here, coming at you with another video from Go Beyond Comics. So today, you guys, we'll be talking about the first issue of Transformers Shattered Glass. This comic flips the Transformers universe as you know it on its head. This new Shattered Glass reality features elements of the Transformers lore that we know, such as the war that raged from Cybertron to Earth, but here the war is between Decepticon laborers turned freedom fighters and the power-hungry Autobot autocrats. The story takes place many kilocycles after the Blue Planet was devastated and the Decepticons were brought to heel. This is crazy, you guys. So let's dive right into the issue. So the issue opens up on Cybertron following this Autobot named Blurr, who's a seeker or master body scrapper, which is basically another name for a bounty hunter. He lets us know right at the beginning of the issue that all the Decepticons that were a challenge were taken out by the master body scrappers, and there's nothing but stragglers left. He's heading to Gold City after completing this bounty, and we learn that Gold City is one of 3 territories here on Cybertron. We see the person you go to for bounties here in Gold City is Ratchet, who Blurr mentions is constantly trying and failing to build an unbeatable bot because he's suffering from trauma of Autobots who have died by his side. Like, yikes. You get to see why Blurr's name is Blurr is because he's the fastest Autobot, which I think is pretty cool. I don't think we've ever seen another Transformer do that. Blurr tells Ratchet how he hunted his last bounty and basically how it was boring for him. However, Ratchet tells him about a bounty that gets him really excited, coming from this person that we find out only that their name is Goldbug, ruler of Gold City. Now, the condition of this particular bounty is that it has to be brought in alive. And we find out that the bounty is Megatron's second in command and voice of the rebellion, none other than Starscream. The issue then takes us to Starscream being hunted down by these 2 Autobot master body scrappers, Chrome Dome and Hardhead. Blurr is watching the whole fight go down because he's measuring how good Starscream is. Hardhead and Chrome Dome think they have Starscream cornered, but then all of a sudden, Starscream pulls out these 2 giant blades, which is pretty damn cool. He takes out the blaster of one of them, but the other has them in their sights and they're about to take him out. But Blurr steps in and saves Starscream. Now we find out that Blurr could have ended this really whenever he wanted to, because Ratchet gave him a beacon that would have brought Goldbug and his men, but his reasoning for not using it is he didn't want to share the bounty with the other Autobots or risk Starscream escaping in the chaos. Both of them end up taking out Chrome Dome and Hardhead. They then leave Gold City and enter the static zone. There, Starscream stops Blurr and pulls his blaster out, pointing it at him. Now, instead of Blurr taking him out here, Blurr comes up with the idea that he'd rather have an epic story on how he took down a legendary Decepticon. His plan is to walk Starscream right into Goldbug's hands. But in order to do that, he needs to convince Starscream that he's on his side. Blurr tells Starscream that he needs the fastest Autobot on the planet, but also at the same time reminds Starscream that he really doesn't have many options. That this is where we get a little bit more details on the territories of Cybertron. First, we know Gold City has a bunch of body scrappers that want Starscream, that's ruled by Goldbug. Second is Prowl's territory, and all we get is that everyone is on the menu there. Third is the Pax territory, where apparently Optimus Prime rules. And finally, the static zone, where they currently are, where nothing apparently can survive because it's a dead wasteland with nothing but lightning storms and volcanoes. Active volcanoes at that. He continues to tell Starscream that only bounty hunters know all the safe routes, and that he's his only hope to survive. In order to push Starscream, though, even more into trusting him, he gives him a sob story about how he was a scout in the war and how he once believed in the Autobots were doing right. and that after the war there was nothing like bots for him to do, that they were couriers at first, but the couriers became too dark, and then eventually bounty hunters in order to move freely. That he really isn't an Autobot, but you really can't be neutral on Cybertron. Now initially Starscream still doesn't buy it, but Blurr says he just wants Pete's, and then he points out that if Goldbug is willing to go to all this trouble in order to catch him, then once the other warlords hear about it, they'll want him too. Starscream eventually accepts his help and believes him, it seems like. He tells Blurr where they're headed but not why. They go by Chrome Ridge, where Blurr actually came from in the beginning of this issue. Blurr says it's the deadest of the deadlands in the static zone. We learn that the volcanoes here are what keep Optimus Prime from taking back Gold City, because it's too difficult to maneuver and it's not worth the bots he would lose. Just when Blurr think everything is going according to plan, Starscream strikes him, showing he truly wasn't fooled at all by Blurr. They battle and it's intense. They go back and forth as the volcanoes around them erupt. Starscream goes to strike Blurr, but Blurr outmaneuvers him easily. He's just simply too fast for him. He catches Starscream in his sights and blasts him, knocking his swords out of his hands. Blurr goes in for that finishing blow, but Starscream last minute flies up. Now this is where the genius of Starscream's plan comes into play. See, he knew Blurr was faster than him, so he took him to an area surrounded by volcanoes and battled him just until they erupted in order to use the magma to trap Blurr and submerge him. And that's how Blurr meets his end. Starscream stays, however, just to make sure Blurr is truly dead. We see Blurr's body encased in this molten rock, and Starscream is talking to him, saying that even though he really didn't mean it, Blurr kept his promise, and he helped him get one step closer to seeing Megatron. We left off with Starscream following coordinates that would lead him to Megatron, and that's who we see next, Megatron walking in the Rust Sea. And we find out this is where he has been going on hundreds of cycles now without seeing another Decepticon. Starscream finally finds him, but Megatron doesn't want to get involved with him, it seems like. He even says that he told Starscream to stay away from there. Starscream approaches but then faints because of his wounds from the battle with Blurr and the gases of the Rust Sea. To me, it really seems like Megatron wishes Starscream never found him. Like, he seems like he's beat down from the countless cycles of war that occurred and he's just given up. He reluctantly brings Starscream to his hideout in order to fix him. Megatron asks Starscream once he awakens like what happened to him, and Starscream lets him know about his battle with Blurr, how there's a sizable bounty on his head right now. He even says something interesting on how he thinks they tracked him. It could have been either he was overheard or that it was Jetfire, but if that's the case, there's nothing that can be done about it. So I wonder, was Jetfire captured and then tortured for information, or worse, betrayed Starscream in the cause? Trying to change the subject, Starscream takes notice of how Megatron's been living and says the great Decepticon leader has been living as a driller. He then talks about the first day he saw Megatron, and Megatron then mentions how Starscream always tried his hardest for Megatron to take notice of him no matter how many times he turned him away. And we find out the reason why Megatron turned him away so many times, because he didn't want to put a scholar on the battlefield, which is interesting to find out that Starscream was a scholar when we know him as like one of the douche Decepticons. But anyways, we then go to a flashback of when Starscream first saw Megatron, and it was during the early protests on Cybertron in front of the Senate. Starscream was there arguing for public funding for his work with Jetfire. We see Megatron arguing with Prowl, who we know now is currently one of the Autobot warlords on Cybertron. They're arguing because Prowl attacked Megatron's friend Ratbat here for getting too close to the building. And Ratbat is an interesting looking transformer. He's a cute little guy. Megatron calls out Prowl here, saying that if he was a part of the counter protest, would he have touched him then? He also continues on saying like how bots have grown comfortable with the pathetic hierarchy where laborers are worthy of nothing but cruelty. That if Prowl knows his name, he doesn't know why he thought he would let him get away with touching Ratbat. I love this Megatron. Megatron is taking no crap from Prowl. Prowl says to Megatron though, He may get his way with things because of his friendship with the senators and Orion, but him and his mining trash are still subject to the laws. And before he can even finish that sentence, Megatron grips up Prowl, telling him to say trash again, and he'll see what trash is capable of. He tosses Prowl on the ground and tells him to run off and tell his friends, tell everyone what happened here. Starscream says that he loved how Megatron showed the Autobots that they're not above them. But Megatron kind of shatters this memory, no pun intended, of Starscream's first time seeing him, when Megatron sees it as the first time he was arrested, being the first of examples of what happens to you when you don't stay in your place. But Starscream kind of tells him that that drama, though, played a large role in his friend Ratbat being elected to the Senate, which to me is pretty cool and funny that that little guy became a senator. But anyways, Megatron finds out why Starscream is really here, and it's basically because he has that huge target on his back and he needs his help. He needs his help to recruit others to the cause, but he needs a leader. Like I said earlier, this is a Megatron who seems like he's given up. And he makes this very clear here when he tells Starscream if things are that bad, he needs a leader, but he is no leader. We then go to a flashback of after Megatron's first arrest. He's set free because of his friend Orion Pax, who we know will eventually become Optimus Prime. And that's what I'm going to call him from here on out, even though they're still calling him Orion. I gotta say, I love the look of this evil Optimus with his glowing red eyes. He looks so badass. This scene we get here is also just awesome because it's a clashing of ideologies here. We see Optimus is pissed with Megatron for not only not thanking him for his release, but also not apologizing for his actions and how their friendship affects his ambitions and plans in bringing order to Cybertron. When Megatron says to Optimus, "I owe you nothing," we find out Optimus has been protecting Megatron in a way. Now, he could be lying, but I don't think so. He says he's vouched for him many times, covered up the chaos of the protests by calling them a fight for rights and to show empathy, that he didn't have to do any of that until Megatron started the Decepticon protests. However, Megatron points out that this all started after what Optimus and his secret police did to Shockwave, who we find out in this reality was a senator. We find out Optimus reinstituted an ancient ritual called Porata, which is Latin for amputate. It's a ritual of removing the heads and hands of those they consider criminals and installing new faceless, fingerless replacements so everyone knows to shun them. That's the torture Shockwave endured, but the surgery went wrong and it consumed and overwhelmed him. Optimus denies having any part of that, saying to Megatron that he's just spouting conspiracy theories, that if he does have that type of power, then he should watch his voice box unless he wants to join Shockwave. This pushes Megatron to the edge. He punches Optimus right in the chest, knocking him back. Optimus immediately responds with a punch of his own, hitting Megatron in the face. Just as they're about to go all out, they get interrupted. Megatron walks away. Optimus tells him that he could have joined him, been on his side, but Megatron simply says, "I could never have been on your side." As Megatron and Starscream walk the Rust Sea, Starscream points out that it looks like Megatron wants to rust away. And I like that he says this to Megatron because it does look like we have a Megatron here who does want to die, who is slowly dying and doesn't want to live anymore. What happened to cause him to feel this way? And that's what we find out. Megatron refuses to help Starscream and be the leader of the Decepticons again, and tells Starscream does he not remember what his leadership cost the Decepticons. We learn what that great cost was with a flashback of the final battle on Earth between the Decepticons and the Autobots. Megatron's given the Decepticons a great speech before the battle, and from this speech we learn that just like Optimus in the normal reality, I guess I could call it, Megatron also crash landed on Earth with some of his fellow Decepticons. They found rarefied energon on Earth, and ever since then they've tried to protect Earth and its resources from the Autobots. The battle takes place after this speech, and we see Megatron and Optimus just going at it. Blasts are exchanged. Optimus throwing a kick, Megatron blocks it, but it leaves him open to a blaster fire to the chest from Optimus. Optimus is winning the fight really at this point, but Megatron refuses to give up. He decides he's like ready to die right then and there to protect everyone. Optimus destroys his blaster, but Megatron swings his sword, taking out Optimus's blaster, but in the end, Optimus was still victorious. Megatron laid there beneath Optimus, and after the battle being left there amongst the bodies, just waiting for his spark to go out, but it never happened. Either way, to him, Megatron, the great leader of the Decepticons, did die that day. He scoured the earth looking for a ship. Once he did, he patched himself up, and he patched up the ship and went right back to Cybertron, only to find that the Decepticons were scattered or dead, and 3 evil warlords were ruling and fighting each other on Cybertron. Though Megatron saw himself as a fool willing to fight a monster like Optimus and willing to be a martyr for the cause, Starscream just tells him how he and his men saw things way differently that day. They saw a dashing, heroic leader dove into battle with no fear, who saved one of his soldiers, Thundercracker, from Bumblebee, fought wave after wave of Autobots, brought down tyrants, and a leader who was a hero. When the Decepticons realized that the battle was lost, Megatron ordered all of them to leave, to round up every Decepticon possible and leave the planet, while he stayed to buy them as much time as possible to sacrifice himself. Starscream basically tells Megatron that just because he lost, that doesn't make him not a leader anymore. And the bots that fell that day isn't his fault. The Decepticons lived on because of those he saved. That if he doesn't lead the Decepticons again right now, they will continue to be scattered. No one else can rally the Decepticons, and they won't join behind anyone else except him. Megatron asked though, even if he did agree to be the leader, what cause could they fight for now? What cause could they rally behind? That's when we learn about a conversation Starscream and Megatron had before about theoretically using Starscream's spark as an indestructible safe. Starscream reveals that it isn't theoretical anymore, that they can use what he has inside him to wake the Titans. So the issue opens up with Starscream and Megatron walking through Gold City, the Autobot stronghold under Goldbug's control. Starscream feels uneasy, vulnerable, casually walking through the city. Megatron tells him that he's not being paranoid. Their disguises do nothing but stall the inevitable. But if Autobots find out and hunt them, then surviving Decepticons will find them as well. And the more that join the fight, the better they are suited to protect the power he carries. They meet with Ravager, who says to Megatron and Starscream that he thought both of them were dead. That Soundwave has been keeping tabs on other Decepticons, spending all his time making sure that any he can find are okay, and assures them that they're not alone. They finally meet with Soundwave, who welcomes them to Decepticon Radio. Starscream points out in his narration that they could go out and find surviving Decepticons, but they can't because of the price on his head. Fortunately though, they have Soundwave. What we also learn in Starscream's narration is that during the war, Soundwave was actually the morale officer who tried his best to prevent the trauma of war. That's one of the big reasons he's created such a network, to keep the other Decepticons going despite the losses they've endured. Starscream wants to use this network to reach out to those surviving Decepticons to fight. What Soundwave says next though really shows us how noble he really is. He tells Starscream that he wants to tear down the Autobot warlords and tyrants as much as he does, but he's not willing to do it at the expense of those Decepticons who've experienced so much trauma. He won't ask them to fight. When Starscream replies that he wouldn't ask him to do that, Soundwave says good, then he won't regret reaching out to Starscream's fellow Seekers. We find out that there are more Decepticons than the Autobots would have people think. That there's a lot out there that still believe in Starscream and Megatron. Starscream worries about Soundwave here, asking, when was the last time he wasn't on the radio? And Soundwave replies, many cycles. That he couldn't risk not being there when someone needed him. I really like this Soundwave. Like, he's just like comes across as so noble, and he really cares about the Decepticons and the cause. We then go to a flashback of when Megatron grabbed Prowl, seeing it from Starscream and Jetfire's point of view. As they're discussing the situation, we learn they both perceive it differently. Starscream sees it as Autobots treating minors as less than, and having no respect for their positions as Cybertronian, and masquerade as civilized but really act like barbarians. Whereas Jetfire sees it as a minor breaking the law and doesn't really care about the minors at all, how they're treated. He only cares about them getting funding for their research to excavate a Titan in order to understand Cybertron more and their history. The next bot they meet looking for funding is Orion Pax, telling him they believe the Titan Metroplex is just lacking the ability to move, that his donation would go a long way in testing this hypothesis. Orion then tosses their datapad, telling them that they've been studying the culture as it pertains to the Titans, searching for funding all over Cybertron just to unbury Metroplex's head so they can speak to him. He basically tells them that that was their mistake, looking for just academic funding and not military funding, seeking to not only communicate but use the power of the Titan, that he can give them both funding as much as they want if they can get results. But what he says next is definitely Orion here playing the Game of Thrones. He says whatever they discover has to be kept under wraps, masking it as not every bot would understand. That's where Starscream asks, despite Jetfire telling him to shut up, who would they be reporting to? And Orion just simply says, does it matter? Starscream walks off saying this conversation is over. Through his narration, Starscream says that he heard rumors of shadowy figures encroaching on the government, disguised as soldiers and senators planning on stealing freedoms. But he hadn't believed it until that conversation. Later, we go to Megatron and Starscream discussing the need to recruit more to the cause after they gather the first wave through Decepticon radio. Starscream mentions about making a statement once they figure out how to use the code within him. Megatron then asks Starscream, is he looking forward to spouting the same rhetoric again? And what Starscream replies really makes a lot of sense, saying, look at what has become of Cybertron. The planet that had once held great cities of philosophy and knowledge has become back alleys ruled by warlords and tyrants. There are many bots out there with no way to fuel and focus their frustration. He believes that if the masses hear from both of them, they might be able to turn more Cybertronians to their cause. Not just Decepticons, but maybe Autobots as well. Starscream then notices more suspicious glances and starts to get nervous that they'll get caught, but Megatron points out something very true here, basically saying to Starscream, has it ever occurred to you while you were busy looking toward the future that you forgot the war we're fighting right in front of you? Megatron then smashes their table, and an Autobot spy that was attached to the table reveals itself. Starscream admits in his narration that it's always been his problem. He looks forward to the future so much he never sees what's happening right in front of him. We then go to a flashback with an excited Starscream saying to Jetfire, I told you we'd do it. They're at their research site, having successfully got funding for their excavation and study of the Titan Metroplex's head. And this thing is just gigantic. Like, it looks so awesome. I can't even imagine what it looks like in its full glory. We see that Starscream is happy to finally be able to study the history and knowledge that could be locked away in Metroplex's head. However, Jetfire has been coming across as grumpy. Starscream notes this, and he understands it because of how much they had to fight to get anyone to listen to them and forget their past and move on, chasing an impossible dream that soon brutes like Orion Pax will see why everyone should have access to their history. Jetfire mentions, though, that he hasn't been able to translate Metroplex's thought speech for what feels like kilocycles. That what if they run out of funding? This is where we see the divide between Starscream and Jetfire. Starscream thinks that the more evidence they have, the more funding they'll get, whereas Jetfire believes they should have just went with Orion's deal. Then they would have unlimited funding and not have to worry about it. That Orion just wants to control access to it. Starscream replies he just wants to destroy it, that those who want to control access, history, and culture are nothing but tyrants. Jetfire then promises to never bring it up again. Meanwhile, after Megatron revealed the spy, Starscream and him are faced with Blaster and a group of Autobots at his side. He says, looks like Megatron and Seeker is on the menu tonight. He says whoever brings them down gets double the contract price. Then the battle begins. Megatron grabs this bot who lunged at him in mid-air, gripping him by his head. He then tosses him towards Starscream, who slices the bot in half. Megatron blasts another bot with his arm cannon. Blaster then strikes Starscream from behind. Megatron grabs Blaster from behind, saying to Starscream, all is lost if you're captured. Starscream escapes, angry at himself, knowing that if he was loyal to Megatron, he would be there, but that would mean he would be disloyal to the mission. He regrets leaving Megatron, feeling like he can't do this on his own. We then go to another flashback with Jetfire meeting with Orion about what they've achieved so far in their research, saying their current theory is that a drive can communicate with the Titan. When Jetfire mentions Starscream, one of the bots here says, "You mean your Decepticon partner?" And Jetfire defends him, saying he's not one. Starscream is then discovered eavesdropping on their meeting. Prowl says he's not an Autobot, he's a Decepticon. However, Jetfire continues to defend him, saying he's not a Decepticon, that he's the most loyal bot he's ever met. That's why Starscream won't cross that line. He then yells at Starscream to tell them that he's not a Decepticon. Starscream replies, "I'm not a Decepticon. The Decepticons are fighters, fighting against the Autobots who are taking our work and destroying what they can't control. You talk about trust when you're okay with that. I trusted in who we are and who we should be. So I may not be a Decepticon, but I'm not an Autobot either. Jetfire, you betrayed us all." Jetfire then hits Starscream in the face, and then in Starscream's narration, he says he didn't even feel the punch. He was already melted to the core. For a moment, he thought Jetfire might still be the bot he knew, where he wasn't alone in a room full of monsters. The Autobots grab Starscream, but he was able to escape. He then heads to the excavation site and starts to destroy all the work and research there, in order to make sure the Autobots don't get their hands on it. But as he's destroying it, he stops himself, realizing he still believes in Cybertron, in his life's work. The Titans had to be a solution to their problem. He decides to bind all the data they had to his spark, but the data transfer was interrupted. He ran out of time. Jetfire had arrived with the other Autobots. Because of this interruption, the data had been corrupted on both ends, turned into nothing but mangled coding. Starscream was able to escape without being captured, but felt miserable from everything that had transpired. We then go to a few cycles ago from current day. Starscream returned to Metroplex after the war. He heard the Autobots try to use other sparks to speak to the Titan, but they weren't strong enough. He knew his spark was the only one strong enough to run the program, even though it felt broken. His isolation after the war gave him the time to re-examine the code. After many cycles, he finally figured it out. He bridged the gap between himself and what he left buried at Metroplex. Starscream ran the program, bound his spark to what remained of Cybertron's path. Every part of him screamed in agony, but also sang in harmony with the words of the Titan running through him. We go back to current day. Starscream is attacked from behind, knocked out. Initially, he hoped it was his fellow Seekers, but he knew it wasn't the case. He knew it was something worse. He awakes to find Goldbug and Jetfire standing over him. The issue opens up with narration from Goldbug telling his origin. We get an awesome reveal here that Goldbug was Bumblebee. He says that after the war he should have been a legendary Autobot. He did more than enough to earn his place as Prime's second in command until he was defeated in the last battle on Earth by Megatron. And the Autobots don't reward failure. As I was reading this, I realized we actually saw his defeat in the second issue of Shattered Glass when Megatron saved Thundercracker from him. Starscream even said in his narration in that issue, it led to Bumblebee needing a new frame. So I like that this was set up early on in the issues. Bumblebee's new body was one of his choosing, one that was stronger and bolder with a new name that wasn't said with a patronizing smirk, but one that reflected his standing. However, after gaining his new frame from Ratchet, Goldbug learns that Prime only approved his revival because he had the means. If they didn't, he realizes his life would have ended on that battlefield. Prime wouldn't have gone out of his way to bring him back because he failed to kill a Seeker and didn't even leave a scratch on Megatron. Now, whispers of that failure spread, and it kind of haunted Goldbug. We go to present day with Goldbug and Jetfire after capturing Starscream in the last issue are torturing him now. They're trying to get him to reveal the Titan communication key. However, the dilemma they're facing is they just can't kill Starscream and take his spark, because if they do, they'll damage the communication key. As Jetfire and Goldbug discuss this, they receive an alert about an intruder. We see this intruder is Skywarp, having teleported in, coming to save Starscream. But his rescue attempt immediately fails when Goldbug discovers him. Honestly, Goldbug is no one to mess with. He gives Skywarp the beating of his life. And through Goldbug's narration, we learn that he feels insulted that Skywarp was sent to save Starscream and Megatron didn't come himself. He takes it as the Decepticons not taking him seriously like Prime did, thinking he's not a big threat when he's an Autobot warlord and even Prime won't come after him. Goldbug grabs Skywarp and takes his head. I couldn't believe this happened. Goldbug is just vicious. We go to a flashback of Goldbug trying to tell Prime about a plot by Prowl to overthrow him. To no surprise though, Prime isn't taking him seriously and isn't worried about Pride, that actually he suspected him for a long time because the war broke something in him. Goldbug gets angry to the point that he even insults Prime, which he immediately regrets. I actually love Prime's reply to Goldbug. He says, "I've conquered more creatures than you and Prowl could ever dream to be. I crushed Megatron and the Decepticons. I need not concern myself with lesser Cybertronians. In the end, I can destroy you with a word and leave you in the gutters." He then hits Goldbug with the drill and says, "Because I'm the one with the power, Bumblebee." Prime just really digging in the knife with calling him Bumblebee. Like, this was badass. Who then appears from the shadows after Prime leaves is Prowl. He basically tells Goldbug that he told him Prime wouldn't listen to him, that Prime really believes no one can take him down, but Prime is right about one thing, that power is the only thing that matters on Cybertron. Whether you use brawn or brains, it's the only thing that really matters. Prowl then asks Goldbug, "Are you finally going to listen to me on how we take Cybertron?" Back to present day, Jetfire, still continuing to torture Starscream, offers him a chance not to die, trying to convince him to live and uphold Megatron's ideals, but it doesn't work. Jetfire begins to think and sense that Starscream is refusing in order to spite him. Goldbug returns with Skywarp's head and presents it to Starscream. One thing that's interesting here that we learn in his narration is he believes it's not Starscream's stubbornness that's the problem, but Jetfire's weakness. That if he didn't need his expertise, he would have gotten rid of him. He taunts Starscream, saying Megatron couldn't bother to come save him himself, and without him, he's nothing. He then orders Slicer to go out to the city streets and kill every Decepticon they see in order to draw out Megatron, while Jetfire breaks the encryption. When Jetfire says he needs more time, Goldbug replies with something snarpy here. He tells him that he needs to do what his boss says like a good little scientist. That if Starscream can't be used to give him a Titan, then he'll use him to give him the Decepticons. Now what we see next is Goldbug really has a temper. Kind of a Napoleon complex going on. Starscream taunts him about how obsessed he is with Megatron, saying he thought he learned from years of kneeling at Prime's feet. Goldbug gets pissed and then tries to kill him, but Jetfire stops him, reminding him of the Titan. Slicer then informs him that there are more intruders. We see the intruders take control of one of the bots here and knock out the other guard. And the intruders we see are the Decepticons, which look awesome here and definitely the perfect stealth group. They're going through the facility, taking out all the guards here until they meet Goldbug, who ambushes them, first taking out Bombshell here. The interesting thing we see here as Goldbug is battling the Decepticons by himself is we see him thinking about a battle between him and Prime that took place in the past. This is where we really see what drives Goldbug and what haunts him. as he's just taking out the Insecticons here one by one. We see in his battle with Prime, he really wasn't a match for Prime. He just couldn't best him and ended up really running away. That's why he's an Autobot warlord. That's why he created Gold City, and that's why he wants a Titan. He not only wants to be like Prime, be feared like Prime, but also beat him in every way possible. Goldbud takes out the last two Decepticons and asks Jetfire what's the situation. Jetfire replies asking has he lost his mind because nothing's changed in the short time it took him to take out the Insecticons. After Jetfire says that to Goldbug says in his narration he's taken out everyone. He's done his part, but there's one Autobot here who hasn't done what he's supposed to do, that he's just begging him to let him be soft. He returns to the torture chamber and points his blaster at Starscream, ready to deliver the killing blow. Final issue. So it opens with narration from Jetfire, where we learn his reasoning for joining the Autobots was because they were the side that represented strength and order. That he thought he was protecting himself. He thought that he was getting away from his past, but his past still haunted him. All because Starscream wouldn't kill him. The reason why he never joined the Decepticons, we learn here, is that they never been strong enough to hold power. That they only brought chaos to Cybertron. That all of the warlords have been able to crush their rebellions. If they were meant to rule, they would have won instead of dying. He's believed this for megacycles, but yet as Goldbug is about to kill Starscream, he wonders why does he find himself protecting Starscream after all this time. Jetfire does his best here to talk down Goldbug, but Goldbug has just gotten to the point where everything Jetfire is saying to him is just seen as an excuse. Goldbug releases Starscream from his shackles and kicks him. Then he orders Jetfire to stop stalling and do his job. As this is happening, Jetfire remembers his last conversation with Starscream before the war that we witnessed back in issue 3. In his narration during the flashback, he says that all he wanted to be was a scientist, but that dream is long gone. To the Autobots, he is an informer. To Starscream, a traitor. And now that Goldbug holds power, he demands him to be an executioner. Starscream, weakened, says to Jetfire to tell Goldbug the truth, that his real reason for joining the Autobots was always because he cared about him, that he wanted to protect him from their war. Goldbug kicks Starscream again, telling him to shut up, that he isn't leaving alive, that either Jetfire will kill him or he'll kill Jetfire and him. All of a sudden, an explosion rocks the entire facility. Starscream realizes that Megatron is attacking the city. He says to Goldbug that he seems stressed, that Megatron has him panicked. We then see Megatron with an army of Decepticons at his side. Out of nowhere, Jetfire strikes Goldbug right in the face with his huge fist. Through his narration, we learn Jetfire did this not because Goldbug was threatening his life or Starscream's, not because Megatron is attacking the city, but because Starscream's words were able to shake Goldbug's control, able to have power over him. He'd forgotten that Starscream's words were always able to shake him. As he's helping Starscream to his feet, he feels like everything is making sense again, that the hole that was in him has been filled for the first time in megacycles. After many cycles and war, these two great friends finally come together again. However, fate has other plans. Starscream is blasted from behind by Goldbug. With a burning hole in his back, Starscream says to Jetfire that Goldbug missed his spark. Goldbug says good, and then freaking plunges his hand through Starscream's chest, gripping his spark. Like, what the hell? Starscream's scream is so loud it echoes across the battlefield. Goldbug then rips the spark out. Jetfire, in shock that his friend is dead, says in his narration that he was too weak to stop Goldbug, that he wants to hunt him down, but he's too slow, too weak to even catch Starscream's empty shell. All of his memories with Starscream begin to flood his mind. He remembers the dream Starscream told him he envisioned for them and for Cybertron. He realizes he was the one who betrayed that dream, that Starscream, even in his last moments, forgave him. All that he asked in return was for him to believe in that dream. Again and again, Starscream gave him a chance to believe, live, and fight for that dream, but Jetfire was always too scared, too weak, to take his hand until it was too late. Goldbug tells Jetfire that he told him Starscream was never walking out of this room alive. As Goldbug walks away, a squad of armed Autobots enters the room. Jetfire then goes into a berserk state, lunges at one of the Autobots here, rips his arms off, and pushes him into another bot. As he goes into battle with the remaining bots here, Jetfire says to himself in his narration that the Autobots promised order, but even when they were in charge, they couldn't keep the Decepticons under control. That if they were half the bots that they claim to be, Goldbug wouldn't have become a petty tyrant. He ripped Starscream's spark out because he's fighting a losing war. A war that Jetfire says isn't his fault. It's Goldbug's, Prime's, Prowl's, and Megatron's fault. The bots in this war fight for their causes, whether it be for power or freedom. Jetfire has had enough of them and their causes. He'd rather have Starscream's voice. Soundwave and a team of Decepticons blast their way into the building. They find Jetfire holding Starscream's body. Jetfire then blasts off with Starscream's body into the sky, and Megatron gives chase in his jet mode and rams into him, saying to Jetfire to take his hands off of him, that he's hurt him enough. Jetfire yells at Megatron, saying to him that he did this to Starscream, turned Starscream against him, changed him from the scholar and explorer he was into a soldier, and now he's sparkless. Megatron restrains Jetfire instead of fighting him, saying to him that this is not what Starscream would want. Jetfire really, in this moment, begins to really accept that it was him who drove Starscream away all those years ago. That Megatron and the other Decepticons took Starscream in after his betrayal. They looked after him, and when he had nowhere else to go, they were there for him. Megatron tells Jetfire that he'll erect a memorial to honor Starscream after he's taken the city, and he asks Jetfire to team up with the Decepticons, and together they can find Goldbug and retrieve Starscream's stolen spark. But Jetfire replies he'll think about it, which is surprising to me. As he's about to fly off, Jetfire has one last request from Megatron, which is to make Starscream's memorial dramatic. Later, we go to this cloaked figure opening a hidden manhole, and this cloaked figure is Goldbug's lieutenant, Slicer, who we find out is a double agent for freaking Ultra Magnus. Slicer informs Magnus that Goldbug has lost Gold City to Megatron. Magnus replies that Goldbug's fall was easily foreseen, that Gold City no longer interests the other warlords. Slicer says that Goldbug still has Starscream's spark, but he is not sure if he knows how to use it. Magnus replies he will figure it out given enough time. He goes on to tell Slicer that he wasn't the only spy in Goldbug's ranks, that word has traveled across Cybertron of Goldbug's new prize. Prowl is waiting in the wilds ready to snatch it from him, and Prime has had plans for the key in that spark for a megacycle. For the Autobot that controls that spark controls the Titans, and the one who controls Titans controls Cybertron. Although he's lost everything, Goldbug stands before Metroplex's head as he slowly awakens. And that is the end to Transformers Shattered Glass, my fellow Beyonders. Holy hell. I told you this issue was so damn good. I can't believe Starscream died. I can't believe Ultra Magnus has been a secret player behind the scenes this entire time. That Goldbug now has the power of a Titan at his side. I hope they have plans to continue this series already, because you cannot end it with this cliffhanger. I would be so disappointed. But just because this series is ending doesn't mean there are not more Transformers videos coming at you guys. As some of you already know, I am trying to cover the entire Transformers IDW universe. I just finished with the origin of Megatron. If you guys haven't seen those videos, links are in the description box down below, or you'll see a link pop up right here. From there, I'm going on to cover Optimus Prime's origin, so be on the lookout for those videos. Other than that, if you guys enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Comment down below your thoughts on this issue and on the series as a whole, and hit that like button. I would greatly appreciate it. Other than that, have an awesome day. Peace, love, and blessings to you and your families. And remember, every day, say it with me, to go beyond plus ultra. See you later, my friends.